you, Julia. So now we have our final lecture by Joaquin Barriendos. He's an associate professor at the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico, Mexico City, and he researches on contemporary art from Latin America and its intersections with global studies and modernist aesthetics. And he's going to speak about Beyond West Aesthetics, a new cathedral for the global Bauhaus.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really happy being here. I want to thank all the people organizing the conference. They helped me with the PowerPoint, Charlotte and Jenny and Irene, and everyone that made possible for me to be here. And I'm happy. I'm really happy because what I have been experiencing since last night, for me, was not expected at all. I felt that is some kind of a new anxiety about what is to be done with the collections, with the museums. And to be honest, before I was a little bit suspicious on what kind of discussion could happen here, because I have been attending and participating in discussions on the global museum and global art and globalization and globalism since a decade or 12 years ago. Terry mentioned Hans Belting project that I participate on that, and also the Georges Pompidou discussions on art and mondialization. And I was a little bit tired of the topic, because it seems to me that everyone's before today, before last night, was feeling confidence on the future or the solution, finding answers to the problem. But it is clear for me today that we have no answers to the problem, right? We have the problem, we recognize the problem, but we are not able to solve the problem from what we are today. That's why you start with the question, what is to be done? What is next, right? So I think this is a potential possibility for the future, right? This radical anxiety. So I'm going to talk a little bit on the Bauhaus and what is going on with this idea of globalizing the Bauhaus, because I think it's a case study that could help us to understand how people is managing this situation. Under the title 100 Years of the Bauhaus, Germany celebrates this year the anniversary of the school launched by Walter Gropius in 1919 with the support of the Weimar Republic. The centenary program includes conferences, publications, and the construction of 3 new museums. It has been advertised, interestingly, as an attempt to build, and I quote, a new topography of modernism all across Germany. And I don't want to spend too much time, because probably you even visited the already open museums in Weimar. This is the light in the night. This is a render, but it's already open. It happened like 2 months ago. You probably have the photograph of Merkel opening the space, right? And also it's going to happen, the new exhibition space for the archives here in Berlin, right? But the new topography of modernism projected by the German government also has a global agenda, the so-called globe-trotting Bauhaus, and they also have this scale transportation of the Bauhaus idea, right? with the support of the Goethe Institute's curators Marion von Hosten and Grant Watson, organized what is called the Bauhaus Imaginista, a large-scale 4-sections exhibition, each of them produced in collaboration with a constellation of global cities. Topics discussed in those exhibitions are very interesting. I don't know what's happening. This is it. Look at the titles, Correspondent With, which is focused on finding similarities between different teaching philosophies, similar than the Bauhaus, that happened in Kyoto, Tokyo, and New Delhi. Also, moving away, like going there, in a way saying hello to the world, and it's focused on comparative design. How can we translate the very term design, Gestalt, to Japanese or another cultures in which the term is not exactly the same, the implications are not exactly that. It's a cultural translation. Hangzhou, Moscow, and Lagos. Also learning from, which as you can see in the Brazilian exhibition, they change a little bit the title, because for those of you who know a little bit of Portuguese, is aprendizados recíprocos, which means mutual learning, not learning from, or learning from, but two ways, right? That focus on pre-modern and non-Western sources of the Bauhaus, which is really interesting for Sao Paulo, New York, and Rabat. And of course, probably you visited the combination of those exhibitions here in the houses of the world culture. That closed, I think, like a couple of months ago, right? It is difficult not to compare this curatorial strategy with the exhibition organized by Herbert Bayer in 1969 for the 50 years of the school. Conceived as a German-American exhibition, Bayer's goal was to disseminate a monolithic idea of the Bauhaus, focused on the functionalist architecture and scientific design. In 2019, the idea seems to be quite the opposite: to collect the global reception of the Bauhaus and to bring it to Germany as a set of transcultural discussions. Instead of exporting to the world an enclosed and fixed idea, the Bauhaus Imaginiste celebrates the exiles of the school and brings home 100 years of cosmopolitan artistic diaspora. In fact, the original name of the project was the Migrant Bauhaus. Apparently, the title was removed at some point to avoid any direct connection with European discussions on immigration policies. Now, in spite of the fact that the organizers of the Bauhaus 100 celebrate that the school was always in dialogue with other pedagogical experiments and modern traditions, and that the German Bauhaus was in fact, unquote, refracted, adapted, and rejected through contact with local conditions, unquote, a series of important questions remain, in my view, opened. To what extent do globe-trotting temporary exhibitions such as the Bauhaus Imaginista actually transform the Eurocentric structure of the Bauhaus collections in German museums? What do museums have to do in order to truly decolonize the myth of the Bauhaus as an exceptional and unique European school? On the one side, they recognize a set of discussions happening in Chile, in Mexico, in Moscow, and everywhere, But somehow the myth of the Bauhaus talks about the exceptionality of this conundrum. It is possible to decolonize the Bauhaus German museums without decolonizing first the imperial collections of non-Western ethnographic and archaeological objects that serve expressionist artists such as Lionel Fanninga, Paul Klee, Johannes Itten, or Vasily Kandinsky to give shape to the spiritual foundations of the Bauhaus. And finally, are the brand new Bauhaus museums in Weimar, Dessau, and Berlin in capacity to become a sort of new cathedral for the global Bauhaus? Is that happening? Or it's going to just kept as a temporary, superficial discussion? As you probably may be aware of, the Ethnological Museum of Berlin, one of the non-Western colonial collections that will be relocated in the new Humboldt Forum, acquired in all the ages between 1899 and 1907 more than 45,000 objects from Peru, among them 7,000 textiles. Walter Gropius studied not only these collections, but also the textile collections kept at the Feuchtwang Museum in Essen, a museum created by Karl Ernst Osthaus, and also Peter Behrens, the famous architect Walter Gropius studied with, was a collector of non-Western art, in particular textiles from Japan, India, and Polynesia that Osthaus exhibited in his museum in 1904. Artists such as Joseph and Annie Alves were also exposed to all these non-Western materials in Berlin even before going to the Bauhaus school. Considering the close relationship that directors, professors, and students from the Bauhaus had with these ethnological collections, it is impossible, I think, to think separately the new topography of modernism proposed by the new Bauhaus museums and the relocation of the non-Western collections at the Humboldt Forum. Both have, in my view, a huge symbolic impact concerning the post-colonial discourse of German globalist museology. In fact, the massive reorganization of these non-Western collections echoes the decision made in 2006 in France when the French government relocated the collections of the Musée de l'Homme in Paris into a new museum, the well-known today the Créronly. This museum was inaugurated in 2006 in the middle of a political controversy, despite the fact that the former president Jacques Chirac conceived and promoted this museum as a post-colonial place for the other, and I quote Chirac, a museum of alterity. I don't know if you know Chirac was an specialist on post-colonial studies. I'm not joking, it was true. He created a team of specialists on the topic for giving shape to this museum. So he called this a museum of alterity, as he likes to describe this museum. Artists and intellectuals and the general public distrusted the good intentions of the president. Daniel Sherman, a cultural studies professor at the University of North Carolina, has pointed out that, and I quote, the curators and scholars responsible for the Créronly have placed it in a post-colonial context and see it as an opportunity for increased cooperation with formerly colonized countries. Yet, in one sense, post-colonial, he used quotations, seems to mean not having to say you are sorry, unquote. But Germany is indeed saying sorry. As you probably know, some years ago, this country officially recognized his participation in what is being accepted as the first massive genocide. The question at stake is this: what kind of attitude is assuming Germany as a result of the post-colonial crisis experienced by the Encyclopedic Museum in the West? As I mentioned, in 2008, I was invited to the project Global Art and the Museum, a series of conferences, publications, and exhibitions organized by Hans Welting, Andrea Budensich, and even Peter Beibel. Some years later, the Pompidou Center organized a similar debate on the Global Museum. In my contribution to the book, The Global Art World, I discuss what I call the geopolitical anxiety and the geoaesthetic revisionism of our museums in the West. In my view, the very idea of erasing the geopolitical hierarchies between centers and peripheries needs to be hand in hand with the following question. From which type of aesthetic tradition of modernity are we to validate the global confluence of Western and non-Western art? How we complete this spheric dialogue? For me, it is obvious that the impulse to correct the geography of modern and contemporary art history leads to the paradoxical result that it could be again the West, the driving voice given for itself the authority to decide what should and what shouldn't be included, when and where these revisions must be placed. If museums really want to decolonize their collections, they need to consider the implications of the very idea of the global museum, that is, the idea of globalism, the ideology behind the attempt to develop an artistic cosmopolitanism within the museum. Going beyond aesthetics, the neologism I use, means our museums needs to go beyond the Western locus of enunciation. I don't know if you are familiar with this idea of the colonial theorist, but it means not speaking from a geographical point of view, but an internalized kind of colonial subjectivity that you transport with your body when you move as a migrant or whatever. Now, since the Bauhaus anniversary is running in the same post-colonial track, that means looking for the presence of the school in non-Western locations such as Calcutta, Tokyo, or Sao Paulo, we need to ask the question of how art historians and curators are attempting to put together the global history of the Bauhaus as a cosmopolitan migrant idea. Of course, this is a big question, and today I have no time to elaborate on the very sources of non-Western, the non-Western sources of the global Bauhaus. But to put the problem in a nutshell, I would say that art historians tend to see modern abstraction as spreading out from Europe to the rest of the world, when in fact artists such as Joseph Albert reached the New World with explicit intention of learning from the pre-Columbian craft the very origins and foundations of modern abstract art, which means there's a trend in which people want to see the impact and the reception of abstraction in other places and to recognize them and put them together and even going beyond comparison. But the locus of enunciation is that abstraction has a point of origination, right? If we read the letters between Joseph Albers and Kandinsky, it is clear that they are looking for different kind of foundational past of modern abstraction. I cannot talk too much on that, but part of the meat behind the idea of the Bauhaus has to do with repressing, suppressing the expressive mysticism and even religious experimentation that was at the very beginning of the Bauhaus in Weimar before 1923. Probably you are familiar with Johannes Eating's idea of vegetarianism and Zoroastrianism and so on. The idea that the body think we are immediately after the First World, so the very project of humanity has been destroyed, right? Is a moment of real anxiety. So the Bauhaus is not a school of art, it's a school of how to sensibly reconstruct the human project, humanism as a project. And they talk about colors as really informing the very internal inner structure of subjectivity, right? So for Johannes Eden, to create means to organize those feelings. That's why they use eschatological techniques before creating art. I know for those not familiar with these origins of the Bauhaus, we tend to see the Bauhaus as a rationalist, cold, functionalist, architectural school, which is absolutely not the case, right? That happened later when it moves to the United States, and we have the new school in Chicago and other projects that happen to make this myth of the Bauhaus and suppress the very expressionist origins of that. This is, for example, is a joke students made to Johannes Itten that put the face of Johannes Itten in an Indian god, right? Just making this connection. And of course, a very well-known travels to Tunisia that Paul Klee and George Muke made in 14, immediately after they published the Almanac of the Blue Rider. So, I don't work inside a museum. I do exhibitions, I collaborate with museums, but I'm not in charge of any kind of collection. So what I'm talking is studying the impact of how collections are organized, how archives and catalogs impact the very idea of the collection and what I call the museographic imaginaries. And I participate in this show that happened in 2017 in the Guggenheim Museum in New York, that a curator made a research on the connection between Joseph Alves and Mexico, and I published an article in this catalog. I'm going to read a little bit on that. When Vasily Kandinsky took the decision to close down the Berlin headquarters of the Bauhaus in 1933, Annie and Joseph Alves were the first teachers to flee from the threats of the Gestapo. Once in America, the couple fulfilled their long-standing desire to travel through Mexico, visiting the country 14 times between 1935 and 1967. Mexico was, for both artists, a laboratory for redefining modern art and design. In a letter sent to his friend Kandinsky, dated August 22, 1936, Joseph Alves describes Mexico as, and I quote, truly the promised land of abstract art, which here is already 1,000 years old, and unquote. Inverting traditional avant-garde primitivism, the Alveses view the pre-Columbian craftsman and the ancient textile weaver as their spiritual comrades. As Joseph put it in 1937, let us recognize again the great discipline of the Mexican sculptor. It teaches us, be truthful with materials, and unquote. Indeed, through modern abstraction, Alves sought to reinvigorate an aesthetic philosophy in which matter and spirit interwing, a constructive belief he found in the pre-Columbian plastic works he photographed in various Mexican museums and archaeological sites. Truthfulness was for him the key concept connecting ancient and modern abstract thinking. He asserted, and quote, let us learn from the Mexican artist truthfulness to conception and material, truthfulness to art as a spiritual creation. It's weird because we see Joseph Alves as really rational and cold and repetitive, and he was looking for a kind of spiritual revelation through what he called constructive colors. Echoing the tradition of the Bauhäuser that made possible the Gothic cathedrals, and extrapolating from the communalist constructive spirit of the medieval guilds evoked by Walter Gropius in the Staatliche Bauhausen Manifesto, Alves challenged anthropological characterizations of the so-called primitive mind, a concept circulated by Lucien Levy-Bruhl in a book published in 1922. From then on, Joseph Albers established a sort of spiritual bridge between his own work and the psychological turn in art he derived from the great discipline of the pre-Columbian artisan. This profound, intimate connection to Mexico has not gone unnoticed among biographers and connoisseurs of the work. However, though scholars have emphasized the formal transpositions of Mesoamerican pyramidal architectures into Joseph's series, such as, I think I have them, graphic tectonics, structural constellations, and of course his well-known Homage to the Square series, the spiritual, even religious correlation between his oeuvre and the pre-Columbian aesthetics has been systematically disregarded, mainly because of the popular belief that his work is called secular and rationalist. This misconception contradicts his notion of art as a spiritual creation and his assertion that the aim of art is the revelation and evocation of vision. My argument in analyzing the connection between Joseph Albers and Mexico, particularly with architecture, is that in 1936, after his first encounter with Mexico, Joseph Albers initiated a long-way spiritual exploration of color, matter, and design that eventually culminated in his famous series Homage to the Square. In my view, far from simply evoking ancient diagrammatic architectures projected from a bird's eye perspective, like looking at a pyramid from above, his homages use constructive colors to unfold the interior of the pre-Columbian pyramid, allowing the beholder to look at the external world from within, from the spiritual foundations of ritual architectonics, in accordance with his idea that, and quote Albers, art is not to be looked at, art is looking at us. This means rather than just physical similarities between the pyramids and the homage, what I think Joseph is doing is inviting us to feel and to experience, to be inside the pyramid, which is the ritual description of how a pyramid works in Mexican and Mesoamerican cosmology. In speaking of a ritual tectonic experience revealed throughout the series, I am not suggesting that Albers attempt in his homages any sort of ethnographic or archaeological descriptive translation of the pre-Columbian cosmology. His homages can be all but the imitation of a formulaic ancient model. Instead, I argue that what the series truly reveals is the combined somatic experience Albers captures, sometimes literally through the photomechanical lens, when visiting places such as Mitla, Tenayuca, Uxmal, and Monte Albán. And just let me show you some of the photomontages he did. 2 minutes? I have 2 minutes, or I don't have 2 minutes? Okay. Is it you put 2 minutes and say cut? This is photographs that Albers took obsessively in Mexico, like trying to find this way to get inside the pyramid and to live out again after this experience. This is the way he put them together. Interestingly, he never showed them to anyone. The director of the foundation in New Haven found them after Joseph passed away. So it was literally a way of studying architecture and color as a spiritual source for his own work. Thank you very much for listening to me.